So when you have visual impairments in mind, obviously this is my wheelhouse, so I have a lot of examples for you all. So I'd love for you to keep in mind both context and style. So when it comes to context, I think it can be really hard for people with visual impairments to wrap their heads around kind of what's going on in the video when everything is really visually oriented. So my number one pro tip is to record your videos as if you're going to completely detach the audio track and release it as a podcast later on down the road. So when I listen to a podcast, no problems whatsoever. Everyone introduces themselves. If two co-hosts are talking to each other about a graph or a map or a picture, they describe it completely. It's awesome. I love listening to podcasts. But then when I talk to, let's say, a friend or something like that, they completely forget to introduce themselves. Maybe I don't recognize their voice at first. I can't see their face. They don't think to describe something that they're pointing out. It's really difficult. So I would always recommend just imagine you're recording a podcast. Imagine the people on the other end are taking care of a baby while watching your video. That's how you want to design it so that people in all those situations can completely still understand your video. I will also say my nemesis is videos that have no voiceover and just have a music track. Maybe there's a photo montage. I honestly don't really know what's going on there. Those are the kinds of videos that really benefit from audio description, which we'll go over later. Or of course, if you just wanted to add your own audio track as well, that's helpful. When it comes to style, there's a couple things that can really help. Maybe these wouldn't help completely blind individuals, but honestly, most people who have a visual impairment are on a spectrum, so they do have some usable vision. I'd recommend making sure there's a lot of color contrast. So you'll see that my presentation is white on black because that works best for me. That works well for a lot of visually impaired people. Black and white is also good. Different people have different needs, but I guarantee no one likes red on pink. Or blue on lighter blue, like those types of low contrast will just be difficult for anybody. And again, encouraging you to think of what if someone's watching this out of the corner of their eye, even if they're not visually impaired whatsoever, high contrast will grab their attention. If you do have text on a background, and I'll show you an example in just a moment, changing the opacity so that the background image, so that the text pops, is always helpful. And then lastly, I've seen that a lot of people use color to differentiate items on a graph. That can be problematic for people with color blindness. So ensuring that there's other methods to differentiate, such as patterns, can be helpful. So let's take a look. I just referenced changing the opacity on text. Visually for myself, on the left-hand side, I can see that there's a background image. If I really zoom in, I can see that there's an E on the end, but everything else just blends in. I believe the word is bad example because I created this presentation, but other than that, I have no idea what that said. Versus on the right-hand side, even though I have very poor vision, because the opacity has been changed and because it's white on black, if I zoom in, I can still see that it says good example. So even though admittedly I do not have good vision, I can still perceive these words because of the example on the right has had accessibility in mind. And then secondly here, I have an example of a graph where the person took care to ensure this is accessible for people with color blindness. So even if you're like myself and you can't tell the difference between these blues and grays, I think it is, you might still be able to see that there's stripes, there's checks, there's dots, so you can understand the difference between the graphs. Awesome. And I mentioned earlier before an example of audio descriptions. So audio description is something that you might add on after you record your video, and its purpose is to describe what's going on visually in the video that you may not have actually said out loud during the video itself.